Modern games continue to require more and more powerful components to run them at a solid FPS. However, that doesn't always mean you need the latest and greatest hardware to enjoy these newly released titles and more. Tossing a few small upgrades into the old family office PC, or perhaps your aging pre-built from 2012, can potentially allow you to easily enjoy many modern titles. The test subject today is an HP Pavilion P7-1597C desktop. Not the most exciting of names, but it will do. This inexpensive pre-built was released early 2013 and served as a general use desktop for several years until the motherboard was damaged, hence the aftermarket ASUS board used. This clunker is currently running with a 3rd generation Core i3 3220, 4GB of DDR3 RAM, and an AMD Radeon HD 5570 1GB graphics card that was released in 2010 with a 300-watt HP OEM power supply. Nothing to write home about for sure, but let's take a look at what it can do in a few popular titles, including CSGO, Overwatch, GTA 5, Witcher 3, and Battlefield 1. Keep in mind these are all benchmarked at 1080p. Letting Counter-Strike Global Offensive automatically set the graphics offers up a mix of medium to very high settings. In the match I played, I was able to keep up, but it did struggle when intensive particle effects started. Playable, but only for a fairly casual player. Starting up Overwatch immediately showed issues, even with the graphics set to low. In order to even get a playable result, the render scale needed to be dropped to 50%, causing the game to look very fuzzy on top of the already low FPS average. Moving on to the more intensive AAA titles, GTA 5 played about as well as expected. Even on the lowest settings, the FPS never even touched 30, and the gameplay was extremely delayed. Looking to push things a bit further, I went ahead and tried Witcher 3. Of course, even on the lowest settings, it was not playable in the slightest. And finally, the last title in the lineup is Battlefield 1. Again, more of the same, with the average FPS at around 14, even on the lowest settings. Clearly, this build is struggling to keep up, especially in the more intensive AAA titles. However, this junker still has some juice left in it, so let's take a look at a couple of upgrades. First off, a majority of modern gaming titles recommend around 8GB of RAM. Luckily, there is an available RAM slot, so this upgrade is as simple as sliding in another 4GB RAM module. Fortunately, DDR3 has recently been replaced with a newer DDR4 memory, so it's fairly easy to find cheap used DDR3 RAM. I was easily able to find 4GB modules for about $20. Moving on from there, the 7-year-old entry-level HD 5570 graphics card is clearly lagging behind. At the time, this card was a cheap way to outperform the integrated graphics, but it clearly can't keep up with the modern titles. Unfortunately, the 300-watt OEM power supply isn't very powerful and doesn't have any dedicated PCIe power adapters to feed the modern mid-range GPUs of today. Fortunately, there are several inexpensive and low-power GPU options available. The main contenders in this area include AMD's RX 462GB and NVIDIA's GTX 1052GB or the GTX 1050 Ti 4GB. Most versions of these cards do not require any extra PCIe power adapters and run purely off the power supplied via the PCIe slot on the motherboard. I do recommend you double check the power requirements of whatever card you're looking at, as there are a few exceptions. In this build, I'll be using the GTX 1052GB as I already have one on hand, and it is a good middle ground between all of the available low-power cards. This upgrade is very easy as well, simply installing it in the PCIe slot on the motherboard. Please keep in mind that not all computers are built the same, and especially with pre-built OEM PCs, you should double check that your existing components will support your expected upgrades. Pay special attention to power requirements, PCIe and/or RAM slot availability, as well as the case clearance. If you happen to have a low-profile desktop, you will need to find a low-profile graphics card that fits or replace the case. Now, let's take a look at the performance of this upgraded clunker. So, right off the bat, we see better performance. Starting with CSGO again, the average jumps to more than double the pre-upgraded performance, even with maxed out settings. Much more playable, even at a more dedicated level. Continuing the trend, Overwatch easily plays on the Ultra preset, offering an excellent average of about 80 frames per second. It looks so much better and played great. Once again moving to the more intensive titles, I was curious to see how GTA 5 handled. The results were surprisingly nice. With the settings auto set from normal to high, the FPS averaged at around 56 and never dropped below the 40s. So much more playable, and it actually looked pretty good. Moving on to the worst performer of the first test, Witcher 3. Considering the entirely unplayable performance pre-upgrade, I was going to be happy with anything that was better. Amazingly, this still fairly low-spec build output an average of 55 FPS on the same low preset. So, still not getting higher graphics quality, but at least over 5 times the FPS average, which is awesome. And lastly, Battlefield 1 also came in with much more playable performance. With medium settings, the average FPS hovered just under 60 and never really dropped under 50. Well, not too shabby. Although it's not the best performance, it still manages a fairly playable FPS in all of these titles, and usually at decent settings. Even better, the total cost of the upgrade was a little over $100, which is pretty affordable in the gaming PC world. The actual upgrades were very simple, but the main point is to show you that your old junker may still have some life left in it. If you're taking a look at your own dusty desktop, here's a few guidelines to make sure it's worth your while to upgrade. If available, I suggest you start with a full-size tower, as they are usually easier to work on and offer room for a full-size graphics card. I would recommend starting with at least a 2nd generation Core i3 or an equivalent CPU, as most anything less will still have performance issues in many modern titles. I'll leave a few links in the description that should help you decide if your CPU is powerful enough. Be sure to pay attention to what RAM your PC is compatible with, and make sure you purchase desktop compatible modules. There is a lot of DDR3 server memory on the second-hand market that is not compatible with standard user desktops. Lastly, triple check that your power supply is rated high enough to handle all of your upgrades. At the very least, you should be hoping for a 300 watt or better, but always make sure you're not overloading the system. Best case, the system fails to power on. Worst case, the power supply fails, which can be very dangerous to you and your components. Alright, well that wraps it up. I hope this helps you look at that old desktop in new light. If you have any questions or suggestions, leave a comment below. Drop a like if you'd like to see more junkers get rigged and upgraded, and don't forget to subscribe for more budget-friendly hardware, build advice, and more. Thanks for watching, everyone.